Hello, everyone. Welcome to February's Kids Mental Health Pierce County webinar, Cultivating Relational Partnerships to Support Marginalized Community with Dr. Jen Temple. Welcome. Very excited to have you here. For folks that don't know, Dr. Ghynecee Temple, we're very excited to have you here today. Kids Mental Health Pierce County is a coalition of agencies, providers, and people here in Pierce County that are looking at streamlining and supporting behavioral health needs for youth and families here in Pierce County. And we are so excited to have you here today to join us to share with our team. This webinar is being recorded. We will have time for questions and answers. So the chat and the question and answer portion at the bottom are enabled for you to use, for members to use, participants to use. We will go through the webinar and leave time for questions and answers here at the end. But if you go ahead and put the questions and answers in during the webinar, I will have those to ask when we get to the end. So welcome, Dr. Temple. So excited to have you here.
Yes, thank you for having me here. And hello, everyone. I know I cannot see you, but I know people are here. So please, throughout the presentation, leave your questions or thoughts, and we will have time towards the end to discuss them. And so while we're pulling up the presentation, I do want to name that I want this to be an interactive and engagement experience. Although I can't see you, I do have questions and things to help us as we work through the content and help you kind of build out or start to think about how you can engage with the communities that you work with and serve to develop relational partnerships. So we'll jump in just a second and then do the deep dive together. Okay, so we can go to the next slide. So I want to thank Vanessa for the gracious introduction. Like we were saying earlier, my name is Dr. Ghynecee Temple. I go by Dr. Jen, Ghynecee, no preference, she, her pronouns, and I'm a licensed psychologist and certified diversity professional. I currently work for the Washington State Department of Corrections as an equity, diversity, inclusion, and respect consultant. And yeah, I'm happy to be here this afternoon with you all. So, a couple of learning objectives for today. First, we're going to define what relational partnerships is, and I'll actually be using the framework from the Washington State um, Office of Equity. Then we'll talk about how to operationalize the relational partnership values and skills, because relational partnerships does speak to personal values that I think are important to lean into as we do this work, and it's also a skill set. And then lastly, we'll be identifying strategies to develop relational partnerships. So all of these things will be happening at once as we're talking through each component of relational partnerships. Okay, so we can go to the next slide. So before we jump into that piece, I think it's really important to acknowledge power and privilege. So there are different wheels of power and privilege, but I usually lean into the Sylvia Duckworth one. It's just the one that I've used the most. And I know oftentimes when people hear the words power or privilege, it can feel very off-putting or scary or make people nervous because people can feel uncomfortable knowing that their identities hold social power, even if you didn't choose to hold such social power. But the goal here in thinking about power and privilege isn't to make anyone feel negatively or upset about having power or privilege, but I think it's important that we acknowledge the privileges that we hold and the systemic power that that gives us. And so when I say the word power, what I mean by power is that we have the ability to decide who will have access to opportunities and resources and who can influence people and or events. So that's when I say power, that's the definition I'll be using. When I say privilege, it's any unearned benefit, power, right, or advantage in society because of our identities. And I want to note that power and privilege looks different across cultures and societies. So this will is more of a westernized version of it, but it could look different. You know, if maybe you're thinking about being in a country in South America or being in a East Asian country. So that will and power and privilege is fluid and flexible and changes depending on our cultural context. And then, so what I really want us to think about as we're looking at this will is to understand where we're socially located. In order to do great work with communities, marginalized communities, other people, it's really important to understand what privileges and power do we have to influence, to impact, etc. So on this wheel, in the center is the word power. Those identities that are closest to the word power represent the identities in our Western American society that tend to hold the most systemic power or have, be able to be in spaces where decisions are made. And as you move to the outer rings of the circle, those identities hold less power. Now, what I want to say is that this isn't a one size fits all thing. You may hold some privilege identities in, closer to the center, but still not experience full systemic power or social power. And I also want to name that we as humans hold both marginalized or can hold both marginalized and privileged identities. And so as you're looking at this circle, take a moment to look at the different identity markers and see where you fall. And this is important because it leads to us being able to recognize areas where we may hold biases and or areas where we may be able to leverage our privilege and power to do the good work with the marginalized communities. And so if you want a copy of this will, you can just go on Google or any search engine that you use and type in Will of Power and Privilege, and you'll also see the different variations and versions. So I'll give folks about 10, 15 seconds, take a screenshot of it, type it in your search browser, etc. And I think this is just something that we should be referring to as we think about how we influence or how we impact the spaces that we occupy. Okay, I think we're ready to move on. So I want to acknowledge that this framework of relational partnerships that I'm using is coming from the Washington State Office of Equity. And so the goal of the Office of Equity is to lay a strong foundation that centers equity in all laws, policies, rules, operations, programs, practices, and interactions. And so due to like my role with the Department of Corrections, we are essentially under the governing body of the Office of Equity. We follow their recommendations, etc. And we also have to work on the Pro-Equity Anti-Racism Plan, which is also called PAIR, which was an executive order by Governor Inslee. And so they are in charge of ensuring that these processes are enacted across all state agencies. And so the Office of Equity is here to really think about maximizing the systems that we have through stronger policy integration and collaboration across systems, sectors, and jurisdictions to make most of the systems we have. And so what this really boils down to, it's really important that we work cross-agency within the community, et cetera, to advance equity. It's not a one agency, one organization task. It is all of us. And so at the bottom of the screen, you'll see the 7 pit stops towards a belonging state. That comes straight from their office. And these are the 7 relational partner values / skills that we'll be talking about today, which include trust, vulnerability, healing, mindset, community, intentionality, and reflection and accountability. So we can go to the next slide. So let's jump into relational partnerships, the what, why, and how. So when we think about what relational partnerships are, I've talked about it as being a value and a skill set, and it is both personal and organizational. And so when we embody those values, we're able to transmit them across the systems, organizations, et cetera, that we operate in. And relational partnerships are really here to help move us away from transactional management. And when I say transactional management, it's typically a leadership / management style that upholds the status quo. It often uses a system of rewards and punishment to produce desired behaviors and outcomes. And typically it solicits a minimal amount of feedback. And so if we're thinking about supporting marginalized groups, people, communities, etc., this type of management and leadership style is not sustainable and does not advance the work of equity. If you think about our systems, some of them have historically been harmful to marginalized communities or left them out of the conversation. So we don't want to uphold the status quo, because one of the things I like to say is the only constant is change. And as we learn, we grow, we evolve, and so should our approach to caring for our communities. We cannot reward and punish people to get marginalized people to do what we want them to do. So that doesn't work. Really, we should be using the voices of the most marginalized in our society to inform our processes, our initiatives, our programs, etc. So why relational partnerships? When we think about relational partnerships, we want to have an equitable distribution of power and resources, and we have to center the most marginalized people. When we add or include the most marginalized people in our conversations about community, and in terms of wherever system that you work in, we're understanding at the most basic level what people need in order to thrive. We want to move from that survival mindset to that, how do we help everyone in our community have a place, space, and thrive? And so when we are prioritizing relational partnerships, we're allocating resources to the communities that need them the most in the ways that benefit them the most, because they know what it's like at an experiential, daily lived experience level, what they need. And we're not here to tell them what they need. And so how do we do relational partnerships? So it's a practice and a perspective. And like I was saying earlier, it's both an individual and a systemic value and skill set. And so we need to have those values and live them in a way that feels authentically for us. But we need to have those values also within our organizations so that we are, building and sustaining meaningful change. So those are the what, the why, and the how. So let's go to the next slide. So this is a bit of verbiage on here, and this scenario will pop up throughout because although I can't see you, I know y'all are there, and I want this to be engaging, but I also want you all to be actively working as we're talking today, in terms of like, how do you integrate these skills and values? And so if you are currently, working on something within your organization or independently that is intended to impact a certain group of marginalized folks, you can use that example. But if you don't have an example, this one is for you. Or if you just want to use this one to work through the workshop today, that's perfectly fine too. So this is somewhat adapted from the Youth and Young Adult Violent Assessment conducted by the City of Tacoma. And so in this example that you can use, or this scenario, your organization is tasked with creating and implementing an initiative to address the steady increase of youth violence, which includes assault, fatal and non-fatal, violence in the home, intimate partner violence, fighting, human trafficking, sex crimes, weapons offenses, and violent crime within your community. A recent youth and young adult assessment report was issued and highlighted several risk factors: LGBTQIA plus identity, violence at home, low socioeconomic status, and race, and several protective factors, which include supportive family, securing basic needs, and having safe spaces for activities. So in this scenario, we're thinking about the issue. This particular issue is youth violence, and we talk about the contributors to that. We're also talking about what communities seem to be impacted the most by youth violence, youth and young adult violence, which is the identities that I named in terms of LGBTQIA, socioeconomic status, and race. And then we're thinking about what are those protective factors or those things that minimize risk, which include the supportive family, etc. So I want folks to take a second and, given this information, what type of program, initiative, policy, etc., would you implement? So be sure to include information about who the target population/community is, what specific issue or issues you are addressing, identify stakeholders. So that should include, community members from the different demographics or social identity that you're trying to impact, and the intended outcomes. So what is the purpose? What is the goal, aim, etc., of what you want to implement? So I'll give folks about a minute or two. I'll give folks a couple minutes to answer these first set of questions. Okay, so hopefully folks have had some, time to think about it. And you don't need to answer this in full. Even if you write down the questions throughout, these are questions that you can use to assess your building of the relational partnerships. So let's talk about the first value skill of relational partnerships, which is trust. And so when we think about trust, I really see it as one of the most foundational pieces of relational partnerships. Without building trust or earning the trust of the communities that you are trying to impact, the work will have little to no movement. Because if people distrust you or mistrust you, they're less likely to engage with you, to be honest, to show up and to contribute to the invaluable work that each of us are trying to do to impact our communities. And so, if we're thinking about how to build trust, and these are the specific skills, like I was sharing earlier, we're going to be doing it all, defining it, breaking it down, and giving you some concrete ways to start to build this skill. So, if we think about trust, first and foremost, honesty and transparency is so important. As a person who interacts a lot with people, it's very difficult to build trust and buy-in without being honest about what's happening. And so when I say honesty and transparency, let's say you're working on an initiative within your organization and it's hit some snags. If you are collaborating with a community group, it's important to acknowledge that. I think some of us, feel very anxious or worried about being perceived negatively if we have missteps or, there are delay in service delivery. But what I find is that when I'm able to communicate like, hey, I'm so sorry, these things have come up that have impacted our ability to get this to you by this date. But this is this is the plan for us to address it, and this is the new timeline. People feel that they can trust you because they know that you'll be honest and you'll be communicative. And so thinking about open communication as a natural segue, that refers to the ability of individuals to freely convey their thoughts and ideas to each other. So as we think about moving away from the transactional style of leadership, management, etc., creating spaces where people can express their thoughts, concerns, and opinions is very important. It keeps the flow of information open, it allows for more collaboration, and people feel that they can trust you because they can show up and voice their concerns and they're heard. When I say consistency in terms of building trust, you know, if you are going to start working with a community group, it's really important to continue to show up. That means, keeping consistent contact, keeping consistent updates, etc. When you're doing that, you show that you're reliable and you become more trustworthy to the groups that you're working with. And then lastly, common ground. Finding common ground can be really, really helpful. Sometimes our organizations may have had negative impacts on the communities that we're trying to serve. And so when we're thinking about finding common ground, what we're really doing is trying to find our shared values, right? Why are we all sitting in this room together? Why does this work matter to both your community and our organization? And so when you're able to establish that commonality, the why are we here, that helps start to build the bridge of trust, because we all know we're in here to do the same thing together and that we're all trying to work towards a better outcome for marginalized communities. So these are some of the ways in which we can start to build trust. And this list is not exhaustive. I think I really want to encourage people to tap into their creativity. What are some other ways that you can build trust? So start to think about that as take these skills and values back into your day-to-day life and into your community. Okay, so we can go to the next slide. So when we think about healing, I want to kind of start with the last bullet point, that we're not here to save the day. Our role is to minimize potential for future harm. Although we may not have been the ones to personally harm or been around during the time where our agency or organization caused harm, we have to remember that we're not here to save people, but we're here to listen to people and minimize that future harm, because that's part of the healing process. So think about it as if, like, you got a scrape on your knee. And if you re-scrape that knee, it's not going to heal, versus where we create space where we maybe put safer protocols in place so you don't fall in the future. Although we can't, undo that wound, we can build some capacity around keeping you safe. And so I want to just to emphasize with that because I think sometimes when we are helping people who we see experience significant hardships or difficulties, we want to be their superhero. And really, our job is to help give folks the tools so that they can care for themselves. And so another big piece of healing work is acknowledging harm and missteps. I think this is really important because a lot of healing can happen when people's pain is simply acknowledged. As a psychologist who had worked for 9.5 years doing therapy, oftentimes people are coming into that setting to be acknowledged, to be validated, to be heard. And a present day example is so with my team in the Office of Equity, Diversity, Inclusion, and Respect, such a long title. Um, in previous years, our office had different leadership, a different agenda, and within that time frame had caused some harm and left a bad taste in people's mouths across the agency. And so what our team has intentionally done is whenever we're first like kind of reintroducing ourselves, coming into a new space, we make sure that we explicitly acknowledge, like, hey, we know in the past that some things were said that really harmed people, and we acknowledge that, we apologize for that, and these are the ways in which we want to move forward. And I can tell you 10 out of 10 times there have been positive responses to that because people just wanted to know or hear from us how we, our acknowledgement and how we plan to move forward. Another big piece of healing is actively listening to the experiences of others. If we're thinking about relational partnerships, we need to make space for people to share their lived experience. And we can do this through listening sessions, focus groups, etc. And really taking into account what are the people saying about the history between their community and the agency. That really helps inform the work that you do going forward. And like I said earlier, helps but build that container where we're reducing harm that we could do in the future. Okay, so let's go on to the next one. So we'll take another quick pause here because I want you all to look at the questions and really think about like how do we build trust and foster healing. So I have the scenario up there just to kind of keep reminding us as we go through. But what are some potential barriers to building trust and how can you navigate them? And then the second question is, how do you typically navigate conflict with others? And I think this question, the second one, is so important because I know that sometimes people like to romanticize how they would respond to conflict, but in truth, not many of us, or I won't say not many of us, but there are a sizable amount of us that do struggle with addressing conflict in ways that are healthy and productive and still maintain the relationship. I always say that conflict will happen. We're human. That is inherent to our nature. But when we are in conflict with each other, oftentimes the goal should be to maintain connection through conflict. And so behaviors like avoidance, shutting down, blaming, not taking responsibility for our role in conflict is very unhelpful. And so I want to challenge us all to be very honest with ourselves about how have I responded to conflict? Think about a most recent conflict that you had, maybe one that you're currently navigating or one that you had in the past. So take a moment to jot down some preliminary thoughts to this question. So I'll give you about a minute or two. Okay. And even if you haven't fully answered the questions, it's still something that you can reflect on later. So the next relational partnership value slash skill is community. And truly, the most simplest way I can say it is that community must be at the center of your work. Not what your organization wants, not what you want personally, but what does the community need? What are they asking for? What are they advocating for? This is how we work to co-create solutions, get them the resources that they need, etc. So when we think about building community, first we need to meet and interact with the community that we serve. I don't know how many of y'all have ever watched Insecure, Issa Rae's show that was on HBO. It's now on Netflix, by the way. But Issa's character was working at a facility, at a job called We Got Y'all. And part of the point it was making throughout the show is that the people who were serving the Black and brown youth of LA were predominantly white folks who had very little interactions or understanding of the needs of the Black and brown kids. And it was highlighted because oftentimes there are so many organizations, and there's research to show this and information out there, that oftentimes people aren't getting out into the community, are not connecting with the community, are not truly immersing themselves. And I truly believe that culturally immersing ourselves is one of the best ways to learn because you're watching community in action. And so that can be attending a cultural event, listening to a panel talk, going to events that serve that community specifically to really understand the who those people are, what they look like, and what they're doing. And most importantly, listen to the experiences of the community. I know sometimes it can be really difficult for people who, let's say, because you don't experience something or you haven't witnessed something, that sometimes our brains want to say that can't be real. That's not a possibility because I've never seen it or I grew up this way. We need to take ourselves out of the center and believe the community, believe their experiences, honor their experiences. And in order to do that, you have to listen to what they're saying. Another big piece of building community is following through on commitments. If you say that you're going to do X, Y, and Z for the community, you need to follow through. All of these relational partnership values and skills connect because when we are not following through on the commitments that we're making to communities, this is how we lose trust within the communities. This is how we lose the buy-in of the communities. And then when we are putting out initiatives, programs, policies, and we get this pushback or lack of engagement, this can be one of the contributor factors. So really be authentic in how you show up. And if you say you're going to do something, do it. Okay, so we can go to the next slide. So when we think about intentionality, it's really knowing why. Why are we doing this? And how are we doing this in a way that is thoughtful and makes sense? And so this really talks about incorporating our values. So if we say we value community, well, that needs to show up across your policies, your programs, etc. And so when we think about how to be intentional, we need to really write out, make public, have it internally what our purpose and desired outcomes are. Oftentimes, people see an issue and we want to jump in and help, right? But we need to take that step back and say, what are the specific outcomes that we're trying to reach? Because then that helps you plan out what does that roadmap look like to achieving those outcomes. We also need to set realistic and measurable goals. So we need to have an understanding of our resources, our partnerships, etc., in order to make these things happen. And one of the acronyms I like is SMARTY. So many of us have probably used or heard of SMART goals, but SMARTY goals is pretty much the same with a little twist. And so it's strategic, measurable, achievable, realistic, time-bound, inclusive, and equitable. And so we really should use that framework when starting to create or promote things that we want to do to positively impact communities. So we also need to continuously measure progress. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in detail on a different slide, but how are we assessing how do we want to assess what we are doing? Because if we're not measuring our, the impact or our goals or outcomes, then we really don't have the best idea of if our program's initiative policy is doing what it is intended to do. And so by talking about how you plan to measure is a way that keeps you accountable, and shows that you are going to be intentional and thoughtful about what you're doing. Okay. So we can go to the next slide. So we've talked about, building community and being intentional. And the first question I would challenge each one of us to ask ourselves is, what are some ways that you can connect and engage with the community you are serving? And think about this on both a personal and organizational level. What supports or resources do you need? So what can help make that happen, so that you are able to engage with the community? And then the second question is, how will you measure the impact of your program outcomes? You can insert policy, initiative, et cetera, but how will you measure the impact? Do you already have pre-existing measurement tools? Do you need to develop something else? Do you need to be creative, et cetera? So I'll pause there and give folks another minute or two to start writing down preliminary thoughts or responses to these questions. Okay. So let's talk about mindset. Mindset matters. How we think impacts how we interact and the actions that we take. And so when we think about changing our mindsets, it is this process of self-reflection. And I always say self-reflection is just something we should be engaging in on a regular basis because there's always room to learn and to grow. And I always say I'm a lifelong learner. So I really lean into the growth mindset and openness with my mindset to humble myself enough to know that I don't know everything, and that hopefully through interactions that I'm having with others, research that I'm doing, et cetera, that I will expand my knowledge base and also, just be exposed to different things. And we have to have a willingness. So if you're a person that's like, I'm stuck in my ways, you need to reevaluate that, and have a different relationship with learning and growth because you don't know everything and your experience is not true or indicative of the experiences of others. And so if we're thinking about shifting our mindset, we need to first identify and challenge our biases. I know people might hear the word biases and get, clam up a little bit, but we all have biases. So boom, you're not alone. This is a universal human thing. We can develop biases from a young age. And one thing that's important to note is that our brains process billions of pieces of information each day. Our brains like to categorize things nice and neat because it doesn't want to use all of its energy to reevaluate situations all the time. So I give this example. If I were, when I was 14, I got bit by a dog. This did not happen, but let's pretend I got bitten by a dog, a certain breed of dog. Now, when I see this certain breed of dog, even if it's not the same dog that bit me, my first inclination, my brain goes to, we categorize this dog as dangerous, it's a biter, stay away. Although I might meet 20 other dogs of this breed that does not bite, that's friendly, I have to actively retrain my brain to say, this dog is, the breed is not, super unsafe or anything. It was that one dog that one time that bit me. So we really need to recognize our biases. And I wish we had more time because I would break down the biases. But if you do a quick search on like different type of biases, there's plenty of lists, visuals, etc., content on different types of biases. It's really important to understand which ones you hold because we don't exist in a vacuum. We can't just leave ourselves outside of our work doors or etc. We bring those biases into the interactions we have with others, either explicitly or implicitly. So it's really important to leverage slow thinking. We tend to engage in bias decision making when we're moving fast and handling a number of different tasks at one time. And so if you are working on a project, especially in the context of supporting a marginalized group, minimize the things that are going on around you. If you need to take a break before working on that project, do so that you're coming into it with slow thinking so that you can be thoughtful and intentional. Engage in self-reflection. It can be embarrassing to recognize the biases or the ignorance that we've held, but the good thing is when you self-reflect and when you seek new information, you're able to disrupt that and then move forward in life with a different outlook so that you minimize the chance of enacting those biases on other people. Educate yourself. Consider where you get your information from. Are you getting it from one source? Are you using diverse sources? Are you listening to the voices, the YouTube videos, reading the books, etc., publications by the marginalized community? So these are different ways in which you can challenge your biases. Another skill is to practice cultural humility. And really, cultural humility is a willingness to learn from others. It means that you're entering a relationship with another person with the intention of honoring their beliefs, customs, and values. And so this relates to like ethno-relative or ethnocentric. Ethnocentric means that we use our cultural experience, our lived experience to say that this is how the world works. Whereas the ethno-relative approach shows that like there are different cultures and belief systems and that I can enter into that to understand a different person's cultural belief systems without forsaking my own. So cultural humility doesn't mean that you say their culture is right or mine is wrong. It just means I'm open to learning from your experience. And then, like I've already mentioned before, seek information from diverse sources. I think sometimes we get kind of hung up on getting our news or information from one place. We need to expand that. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. So vulnerability as a, person who's done therapy for a long time is super scary for people, and I understand. When we are engaging in vulnerability in this sense, it means we're participating and creating an environment where people feel safe to take risks, where people can share their ideas, they can be authentic without fear or judgment, etc. And so it doesn't necessarily mean like pouring out the most painful parts of your life experience. It just means being able to be heard, to be seen, to share, and to show up as your full authentic self. And so, as we think about deepening vulnerability, we need to understand our boundaries. Where are we at on the vulnerability scale, right? Some of us might feel really uncomfortable with sharing even basic personal details about ourselves. And so, really, as you think about where you are in the vulnerability spectrum, start to think about what are the smaller baby steps that you can take to feel more comfortable being vulnerable. And I do want to name too that maybe some of our organizations, etc., are not psychologically safe. And so we are not able to really engage in vulnerability. And I don't want to deny that experience. So, this is speaking to the people who are in spaces where they can. But even if you are not, there are ways to show up with the community that you're working with or impacting in a way that allows for them to be vulnerable and for there to be some kind of exchange where they also still get to know parts of you. So the next piece of it is identifying your needs for psychological safety. And so when we think about psychological safety, it's really just that ability to be able to share your opinions, show up as your authentic self, challenge ideas or things that are happening, etc. And so psychological safety is broken down into 4 quadrants. So we think about inclusion safety. So it means you are welcome into the organization as your authentic self. So think about how you are creating that for the marginalized communities that you're working with. How do you include them and do you make space for them to show up authentically? Learner safety. You are free to ask questions and make mistakes while you learn. I think that's a bi-directional thing because we're not perfect as our agencies, etc., are continuing to do this work of equity to change systems, etc. We're going to step in it. We're going to make those mistakes. But are we creating environments where our colleagues feel safe doing that and where our marginalized communities feel safe doing that? Because they will also misstep because historically they have not always been invited to have a seat at the table, and beyond having a seat, be able to have a voice at the table. And beyond having the voice, be able to have the power to influence what happens at the table. And so the third quadrant is collaborator safety. You're encouraged to share your ideas without fear or retribution. So people should not feel fearful to share their thoughts, opinions, beliefs, etc. Obviously, everything should be communicated with respect, but people should not be fearful to show up and say what they need to say. And then lastly, challenger safety. You are safe to question the status quo, raise concerns, and provide dissenting opinions without fear of negative consequences. Especially if we think about communities where there's been harm, they may challenge a lot of the things that your agency is trying to do or your organization. We should make space where people feel safe to challenge because challenge means people are passionate, they care, and that they have concerns about how things are going. So even just reframing some of those more difficult aspects of communication can help us do good work with people. And then lastly, remember that emotions are information. And I say this because depending on the group that you're working with, and depending on the group that you represent, when people are highly emotional, people want to use that to invalidate or denigrate the message. If people are showing up passionately or apathetically, etc., that's information. Apathy could be a sign of they don't have trust in you and what you're trying to do in their community. Anger could be because they're really suffering and they're tired of waiting for the resources, for the support, for what they need, and they're tired of asking people. So remember that emotions are conveying important information and that we need to check our reactions to people's emotions to really understand what is this signifying. Okay, let's pop to the next slide because I want to make sure we have time for questions. So I'm going to speed it up just a little bit, but we're really almost towards the end. So the last piece of this is the reflection and accountability. And so we really need to do that work of self and organizational reflection. So we've talked about reflection throughout. And we need to understand how we play a role in oppressive systems. And this can be challenging for us because I think many people, like, even if we're playing a role, especially like implicitly, we still need to make that acknowledgement and give that effort to create new pathways for change and healing. And so if we're thinking about it, we need to understand how our lived experiences and biases are showing up in the work. Like I said previously, we don't exist in a vacuum. All these things happen. All the things that we've experienced can show up. And so we need to be accountable to manage those things, to address those things. Another way we can remain accountable is to review policies and practices with an equity lens. And so that really entails asking questions like, what is the policy designed to do? Or initiative or program? What is it not designed to do? What is the, impact, outcome, and design? So what is it intended? What's the intended impact? What's the intended outcome? We also need to think about as we're pushing out initiative and programs, does it account for disparate outcomes on other groups? So if we do this, how does it, include or exclude other groups? And does it even need to, consider other groups, or is it just focused on one aspect of the community? We need to ask ourselves, will this policy program initiative increase access and opportunity for underrepresented communities? If so, how? We also need to think about what are the mechanisms in place to ensure accountability. So are we going to have equity focused benchmarks or indicators? And if so, what are they? And then lastly, we need to be asking for feedback from our stakeholders, from our staff, et cetera. We need to know, how are we doing? How are we showing up? What could we be improving upon? What processes need to change? And so this is how we continue to be reflective and accountable. Okay, so we can go to the next slide. And I realized that that title should have just been the reflection and accountability, because here, this is where that title should have been. But anywho, so if we think about the last 3 slides about the mindset, vulnerability, and reflection accountability, what are some personal biases that you have that could impact your work with this population? What does vulnerability look like for you? So understanding where your limits are. And then lastly, how do you know that your policies and practices are equitable? Do you utilize, an equity assessment? If not, maybe you should. How are you keeping track of the impact of your work, essentially? So I'll give folks about um, a minute to maybe take a screenshot, write it down, because I want to make sure we have a minimum 10 minutes for questions. Okay, and we can hop to the next one. So ultimately, we covered the 7 pieces of the relational partnerships, and ultimately the goal is to create belonging for sustainable change. When people feel that not only are they included, but they belong in these spaces to help make decisions and have impact, they will be invested, and we will continue these partnerships and continue making the important and necessary change to make sure that each member of our communities are supported in the ways that make sense for them. And so we want people to be their authentic selves and just know that their voice matters. So when we think about cultivating belonging, we need to assess group and community stakeholders' sense of belonging and inclusion. So you can ask questions to understand how they feel about their experience, like, for example, employees. So understand how they feel about their experience at work. Um, Identify high priority areas of improvement. So do we have lack of mentorship opportunities? Are there microaggressions? What's happening? What's impacting your agency? What's impacting the people in the community, etc.? We need to leverage the power of differences. Diversity is a great thing because it includes not just social identities, but diversity of experiences, diversity of thought, diversity of knowledge. And that way we're getting different people in the room that can think about things that we might not, because like I said earlier, we don't know everything. And so when you're trying to create belonging, having different perspectives and those different considerations is how you help people get what they need and help them feel like they belong. And I think most importantly for me, lead with empathy. Empathy is that skill set of trying to understand another person's experience. As a clinician, one of the things that mental health therapists are trained on and have to demonstrate is our ability to empathize with the experiences of others. That is foundational to creating sustainable relationships and doing change work. So let's hop to the next slide. So I want folks to think about, these questions and take a screenshot, write it down, but I want you to, at some point, write out 3 to 5 questions that you can ask members of your organization and stakeholder groups to assess their experience of belonging and inclusion. And how will you handle pushback and or negative feedback from community stakeholders? Like I said earlier, depending on what the community has experienced, either just in general or with your organization, there might be a lot of pain, hurt, and anger. We have to anticipate that there could be pushback on the things that we're wanting to do. We have to understand that there could be negative feedback about our organization, either from current or previous practices. And so we need to really think about, how will we handle that? How will we use these 7 values and skill sets to help us address those instances? Because like I said, conflict is inherent to being a human, and it will happen. And I think if we understand how we can respond to needs, then we're able to continue the work, and make necessary repairs in relationships and continue to move forward. So screenshot it. Hopefully you write this down, and this will be recorded so you can revisit this later. But let's go to the next slide. So our learning objectives were to define relational partnerships, operationalize relational partnership values and skills. That was the bullet point pieces. And then talk about the strategies to develop relational partnerships. So one takeaway question that I hope everyone can reflect on is, what is one component of relational partnerships that you would like to enhance? So we talked about 7 different ones. And I always think it's wise to, start with one and then build it out from there. So think of where you can start right now, what you can commit to, and work towards. So with that, we'll go to the last slide. And I just want to thank everyone for your time this afternoon. And if you have any questions, inquiries, etc., my email is jimmarie@gmail.com. And so I want to pause here so we can take any questions that have come.
Thank you, Dr. Temple. I'm just so grateful that I got to be a part of this and learn from you today. I don't have questions that have popped in yet. I'm going to give folks a moment here to put some. It looks like we have a raised hand. If you could put that in the chat, I'm not able to allow you permission to the whoever raised your hand, but the question and answer feature at the bottom, you're able to type in your question. Apologies for not being able to let you ask in person. I'll wait a minute, but thank you so much. I just feel like this is hugely important to all of our organizations and our personal development and growth. I loved the lifelong learner comment. I think we all should be. And once we get to a place where we don't feel like we are, we should reevaluate that for ourselves. It's so important to the work we're all doing in all different spaces. And I had never heard the SMARTie. We developed SMART goals, and I've never considered the IE. And I think that will be something that I utilize moving forward. And so many things that you said, but that is one that I think is really important too, as we evaluate our own personal goals and our as well as our professional goals moving forward, all add those. That should always be included as we move forward. I do not see questions. I saw a lot of claps. I see a lot of folks that are, here is one. Would love to explore emotion as information and how significant culture is.
Yeah. Okay. So let me know if I'm answering it or not, but I'm thinking about the emotion as information. So if we think about like culture, right? How we think about emotion changes culture, can be different across cultures, right? And so I think that requires us to think about, as we are working with particular groups or individuals that have different cultural identities, doing our research, right? It doesn't mean that this person exactly experiences culture in the way that we found as we did our online research or did our reading, but it means that it gives us some context. So for instance, one of the things I was trained on is that some folks of Asian descent may not make eye contact, right? But that's not all the Asian people I know are not necessarily not making eye contact, but understanding it's a respect thing and stuff like that. And so if it's lack of that, it doesn't mean they're not engaged or don't care. It's just a cultural piece. But being open to that and using that as a reference, but not using it as like the absolute law, if that makes sense. And so really trying to understand, or asking people, right, if we're unsure, like, can you tell me more about how you're feeling? As we're sharing this thing, what's coming up for you? And that's another way to get the information from people that hold different identities or cultural backgrounds from us. So I hope I got close to an answer.
Yeah, that is really helpful. Someone mentioned I appreciated the reminder around normalizing conflict as part of connecting and growing together. Um,
Absolutely.
for sure. Another, people might not know how to ask questions because the chat is disabled. Oh, I'm sorry that the chat said it was enabled on my side. Okay, so we were asked to submit questions. So you're able to, if it says Q&A, put them down there. Thank you. What if a partner has done harm and shifted leaders, only acknowledging they've done harm and still want you to be at the table, but never, uh, is that is that being petty and should we move forward with them?
What if, yeah, okay, I'm just reading to make sure I'm understanding. So what if a
Yeah,
partner has done harm and shifted leaders, only acknowledging they've done harm and still want you to be at the table, but never, like, I'm assuming like had a one-to-one
yeah,
discussion?
it says never had a one-on-one. It looks like it was corrected. Never had a one-on-one.
Okay, it has been, is that being petty? I think I don't think it's being petty. I think we should honor how we feel. But I think one of the ways to address the conflict is to kind of name if there are residual feelings that we're having, being able to share that, and then co-collaborating on what makes the most sense to move forward, right? Because I've talked about barriers to navigating conflict. So is this conflict going to create a barrier to the work you want to do? If yes, then that means more conversation is probably needed. Before you can feel comfortable or another person can feel comfortable with moving forward with the work.
Thank you. And then someone added, thank you, a lot to consider and ways to organize my intention and self-evaluation. And I think that's really a lot about what you talked about is the setting the intention and looking at what we do. So again, just appreciate you and really grateful for you being here. I saw a lot of thank yous, a lot of claps, and a lot of hearts, and I extend them on behalf of Kids Mental Health Pierce County as well. Just very appreciative of you for being here today and sharing your wisdom, your experience, your knowledge with us all. My information is up here. I know Dr. Temple shared hers as well. There's a QR code for Kids Mental Health Pierce County website. And I just, again, want to thank you all for attending. Thank you, Dr. Temple, for being here and sharing today. And if anyone has any questions or follow up, please feel free to reach out to myself or Dr. Temple. And thank you again to our community. We are appreciative.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. It was great being here. Thank you, Vanessa, for all your support and getting this going. And yeah, I hope to, if any of you have questions, like I said, reach out and I'd love to chat more. Okay.
Thank you so much.